Now we're going to talk about something that I love discussing about. It has to do with private prisons and how they are trying to utilize legalized bribery here in the United States to make sure that politicians in the state of Oklahoma consider them while they reform their prison system. Now, what they do is they pay politicians as much as they possibly can in campaign donations to ensure that inmates get funneled through the public system into the private system so they can make as much money as possible. They also make sure that politicians pass tough on crime legislation so we can criminalize people for doing nonviolent things like smoking marijuana. Now, to give you an example of just how much money they've donated in the state of Oklahoma, and of course this includes GEO Group and Corrections Corporation of America, they gave Governor Mary Fallin a total of $38,250. That's a lot of money, and keep in mind that politicians are not that expensive. They can be bought very cheap. Okay, House Speaker T.W. Shannon got $35,950. Senator Clark Jolly got $29,301. Treasurer Ken Miller, $17,500. Just to give you a wider scope of how much they've spent, since 2004, private corrections interests and those who represent them have spent a total of $414,397 to fund elected officials' campaigns. So obviously they have a tremendous amount of influence, and it's problematic for a number of reasons, and I want to bring our panel in to kind of discuss it. Now, Gina, let me start with you. Is this an example of democracy at play, or is this crony capitalism?
Here's the thing. I think this is like the ultimate crossroads, because I'm like, yeah, capitalism, hey, that's how it works, and I don't know what to tell you. Yeah. But in prisons, schools, prisons, things like that, things where people are, we're supposed to be taking care of them in some way or another, you're not allowed to bring businesses in. I mean, I always joke, I can't believe high schools aren't named like, oh, I'm on the Sprint campus. Or, I mean, there's a reason we don't do that. So how are we allowed to do this with prisons?
I hate private prisons with a passion that is indescribable. And the reason why I say that is because we lock away more people than any other country in the world, okay? Peter, jump in.
I would disagree there. I think there's nothing really wrong with private prisons if you did the right incentives. So right now the incentive is you keep the most number of people as cheap per person as you can. That's the wrong kind of incentive. Let's harness capitalism and say, okay, someone's committed a crime, they're convicted, they're sent to a private prison, they do their time, they get out. If a year from now they haven't committed another crime, give the private prison $1,000. If they haven't committed a crime for 10 years, $10,000. 80 years, $80,000. So in other words, you're paying the prisons for rehabilitating people and getting them out of prison in an effective way, right? So if you come in with a drug habit, then the prison would be advantageous for them from a capitalistic standpoint to give them some rehab treatment.
Right, so we focus on lowering recidivism, but we
Exactly, what we want is the outcome. We want people who commit crimes to go to a place where they learn not to commit crimes anymore or get the abilities not to do things that are illegal and do things that are actually useful for us.
And the prison still gets their money, so
and the
there's
prison
nothing
gets
for them
their
to cry
money.
about.
So again, it's a question of what are you incentivizing in terms of capitalism? If you incentivize something that's for the public good, which is to reduce crime, which is to reduce criminality, and you pay people for doing that, then I think a private prison would probably switch its tactics and might actually be a very good way to do it.
That's a really interesting perspective, but I mean that incentive structure doesn't exist, and it never will. So as a result, we will continue on with this, with this structure that criminalizes people for behavior that they shouldn't even be criminalized for.
Saying it would never change.
It would never change because
if it's profitable for the people running the prisons, if they could make more money doing this in another way, don't you think they would change because they're just eager to get more money?
Yeah, but that would actually require them to do something beneficial for society, and they're not looking to do that.
But if it's profit margin,
there would be a profit margin, right? But it's a lot more difficult to rehabilitate people than to have the system that we have in we have in place right now, where all you have to do is you buy a politician, you pass really tough on crime laws, and you, for instance, detain undocumented immigrants for as long as possible before deporting them. I don't even understand why we do that. Why are we using taxpayer dollars to detain and imprison? Exactly.
To keep people we're trying to get rid of.
Exactly. So that's just one example of that. But I do really like your perspective. I never heard that before, and that would happen in a dream world. But
yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think that it's a very clever idea. The problem is at the heart of it, where you say we should harness capitalism. I think capitalism has harnessed us. Right, we now serve the institutions. We serve the corporations. It's, you know, people are historically worried about Frankenstein monster, that we create this thing, you know, whether it's a robot or artificial intelligence that takes control. We've done it. It's called corporations. You know, they've got legal rights. They've got, you know, the Supreme Court's arguing whether they have religious rights at this point, you know, but chimpanzees don't have any rights, right? Intelligent animals have no rights, but these entities that we've invented that are legal fictions have more rights than many human beings. And certainly are easy, how can I say this? They're immune to prosecution. Because they don't exist. They're not real, you know?
They's not a he.
Yeah,
it's
exactly. It's an it that can disappear and reappear in a different form at an instant. It's amazing.
The Supreme Court also made a ruling recently that makes it very, very difficult for people to get together to file a class action lawsuit against corporations. I mean, this is ridiculous. Right. It's ridiculous how much sway they have over our political system.
That's it. The political system does not control the corporations, which is necessary to do what you're talking about, to change the motivations and the incentives. Who's going to do that? There's no, you look, historically, you can always tell who has the most power by who has the the tallest buildings. So in Europe, initially it was the churches that had the steeples, and then it was the town halls, the city halls, and so on. And now it's bank buildings all over the world. The tallest buildings are banks and oil buildings. They've taken over. So at this point, I don't see any countervailing force that could change the incentives the way you're suggesting.
And Peter, another thing is, I don't think that the incentive to pass tough on crime legislation would go away under the structure that you're mentioning now, because you want to have as many inmates as possible come in, and under your idea, you would try to reform them,
and get them out as quick as possible.
And then get them out as quick as possible. That's true, but it still provides an incentive to lock people away.
Right.
And
so again, that's a different question. Again,
Yeah.
if you're arguing, why should we be locking all these people who aren't violent? That's a very different question. But if you're going to have a prison system, and I assume that we must have a prison system, then you can sort of say, what is the most logical prison system to get the most societal good? And in ways that we can harness our selfishness, again, to make money, to do other things, to do that, but also go for the public good, is a good way to go. I mean, again, so corporations are selfish organisms. And the more we can get them to behave selfishly, but in ways that also maximize the public good, that's wonderful. There is this problem, again, of corporations. One thing they don't have is they don't have votes. They have to influence people to vote their way, which is another whole topic we can talk about, is why do people so often vote against their own personal interests? But again, if you can just make the argument that you have a more rational way of imprisoning people that would make the society better, let's see where that goes.
Well, I always like to remind the audience why private prisons came up in the first place in the United States. In the 1980s, we were locking away so many people for nonviolent drug offenses that these corporations realized, these enterprising individuals realized that, hey, you know what? We can make money off of this. So they started building the for-profit prisons, and boom, they started pushing the war on drugs further. We started locking away more people. And again, we lock away more people than any other country in the world. And that is definitely problematic.
While distributing the most prescription drugs.
Absolutely.
So it's all very hilarious.
I know, it's all very ironic.